So I don't know when I first met Bill, but I do know when I first heard him talk. And it turns out that what I'm going to be talking about today traces right back to that talk. So it was, I can't remember if it was 1984 or 86, but it was at the PSA. Bob Batterman and I, within graduate school, we used to go to the PSAs. And I was just getting interested in kind of decision theory stuff, and I sort of wanted to see if there was anything interesting happening in the area. So I went to this talk, to a symposium, and one of the speakers was Bill. And I still have a vivid memory of that talk. I have in particular a vivid sort of visual memory of Bill sort of standing over the side here and waving his arms, explaining how, this view that he was defending had to be right. And it was sort of one of those great talks because I left it and I was excited about the subject and I wanted to learn more about it, and it turned out I did. And so, I'm sure this has happened to sort of many other people, but I remember that as a very important event in my professional life because it really did give me some sense about how philosophy ought to be done and how it could be exciting. So anyway, Bill, thanks for that and thanks for all the other things. But I'm sure this happened to many people. In that talk, Bill was defending a view, which he convinced me of, called causal ratifiability. Now, I'm going to explain this in detail in a minute, but sort of the rough idea is this. Look, there's a way of thinking about a decision theory, called causal decision theory, which I guess the original idea goes back to the Stallmaker, but it was developed by Gibbard and Harper in a famous paper, by Brian Skirms. Brad Armand has made important contributions, David Lewis. And what Bill was advocating adding to this was a principle which says, roughly, I'll make this more precise, it says, look, when you suppose you're going to perform an act, you recognize that you'll regret it in light of the fact that you're going to perform it, then that's a reason not to choose the act. And as I say, when I heard this talk, I was convinced. I've actually written the papers in the intervening years where I've sort of used this idea, but I've come to have some second thoughts. So after sort of 25 years, I have an objection to. All right, so we'll start. All right, so just some background. So the idea here is that we're going to be working within what's called causal decision theory, and roughly the idea is that look, what you want to do when you act is you want to choose courses of action that causally promote desirable results. Right? And it's important, causally and promote is sort of the important thing there, right? There are these cases, we'll be talking about them in a minute, right, where you have actions that sort of indicate that the world is in a good state, even though they don't do anything to causally promote that state. And a part of what causal decision theory says is you want to sort of ignore that evidential value of your actions, the evidence that your actions have indicating desirable states. All right, so there are a number of ways like to formulate the theory. They're all, I think, kind of equivalent. But I'm just going to work with a sort of a bread and butter kind of a version. The idea here is, well, you want to calculate the expected utility of an action. How do you do that? Well, you choose a partition of states of the world which have the following characteristic. What they do, roughly speaking, is the elements of this partition are various hypotheses about the way that that desirable or undesirable things causally depend on what you might do. This version of the theory is sort of I sort of associate most with Brian, I guess, the K-partition version. There is a version developed in sort of a famous paper by Bill and Allen, in which they express this theory in terms of counterfactuals. I think for our purposes, there's no real difference between these two things. All right. Now, here is a crucial thing as far as our talk today is concerned. If you're a decision theorist, you maximizer here, as I'm calling it, you're going to treat information about what act you are sort of likely to do as irrelevant to your decision making. Important caveat, except insofar as information about what you're likely to do gives you evidence about what your acts are likely to cause. Okay, important caveat. In cases where acts indicate outcomes that they don't cause, the causal decision theorist says, look, those are the kind of evidential implications that you ought to be ignoring. All right, we'll come back to this in a minute, but let me tell you how I started to get worried about this like ratifiability business. So in the Gibbard and Harper paper, counterfactuals in two kinds of expected utility, they have this famous case, death in Damascus. People probably know this, but I'll just go over it quickly. The case is this, right? You're, let's say, you're on the road halfway between Aleppo and Damascus, right? And you're in an unfortunate spot because you know that death, the Grim Reaper, he went out this morning looking for you, and he made an inference about where you end up being, and he's either in Damascus or Aleppo. He's waiting for you. Now, if you end up in the same city as the Grim Reaper, you die. If you end up in the other city, it's good, right? The problem is that you've got very good reason to think that death is terrific at anticipating your acts. He's done a brain study on you, and it's so you're here in the middle of the road, and you're thinking, okay, Aleppo. You think, how about if I do that? And you think, gee, suppose I go to Aleppo. That seems like pretty good evidence that that's where death predicted that I would go. And so, given that I'm inclined to go there, that seems like a really terrible idea. I regret it. I ask myself, gee, suppose I go to Damascus. I reason exactly the same way. If I go to Damascus, that's a place where I was predicted to go. I will regret it, and it looks like I'm sort of stuck in this unstable kind of a spot where I can't make any rational choice, because any choice I make gives me a reason to think that the causal consequences of that choice are going to be bad. All right, now I began to think about this kind of case because there's a recent paper by Andy Egan, in which he offers what he calls a series of counterexamples to causal decision theory. Now, they're counterexamples to something, but it turns out, as I'm going to explain, they're not counterexamples to causal decision theory. But thinking through these kinds of examples has sort of led me to rethink the ratifiability idea. So that's where I want to go today. So let me give you the example. This is just sort of a different death in Damascus example, a little bit asymmetric. So, but I'm going to use Egan's example because I'm going to use his example in part because people have been coming up to me recently and saying, gee, do you know about these counterexamples to causal decision theory? So I want to sort of make sure that people in this audience know how to answer that. So here's your situation. You live in this country where there's this King Alfred, and Alfred is awful. And it would be good if he died. And it turns out that you're in this interesting spot. You've got a gun, and it's pointed right at Alfred's head, and all you need to do is pull the trigger. You don't have any moral qualms about killing Alfred. You know, he's the kind of person who permissible to kill. I don't know. Who knows? But there's a problem. This is the usual kind of a Newcomb problem. You know, it turns out that not everybody has the nerve to kill. Right? I mean, in order to pull the trigger, you got to have something special. Not everybody can do it. And unfortunately, you're a member of a population where 20% of the people, I think I have right, have this sort of lesion, this brain lesion, and it has sort of two effects, right? The brain lesion has the effect of giving people the nerve to kill. So if you have the lesion, you know, you're probably going to be able to shoot, right? But unfortunately, it also makes your hands wiggle, right? And if you have the lesion, it's highly probable that if you shoot, you're going to miss, right? Now, people who lack the lesion, it turns out, you know, are timid. They don't shoot typically. Some of them do, but few. But the thing about them is their hands don't shake, and so if they shot, they would kill elephant. All right, so with these numbers, the kind of a picture you get is this. This slide is just here so that you have the numbers. I'm not going to go through them all, right? But so the basic idea is, well, look, you're sort of in this spot where if you have the lesion, you think it's very probable that you'll shoot. If you lack the lesion, you think it's very probable that you won't shoot, right? Given these numbers, these are actually important ones. If you shoot, conditional on your shooting, the probability that you have the lesion is really high, which means the probability that you're going to miss is really high. And if you don't shoot, the probability that you have the lesion is, you know, really low. So the probability that you're going to kill Alfred if you shoot is really low, right? Okay, so that's how things all work out. That's how things all work out. And the thing I want to call your attention to down here is if you use these numbers and these utilities that I have over here, which I just kind of, for the purpose of the talk, just made up numbers. But if you use these utilities and you use those probabilities, it turns out that you do the calculation and the causal expected utility of S shooting exceeds that of not shooting. And so Egan says two things. He says, okay, so look at that. Causal decision theory says shoot. Right? Higher expected utility. Right? And then he says, but look, just think about the case for a minute. And he claims that this is the modal response that he gets from people. You know, it seems like shooting's just the wrong thing to do. You should refrain. Now, I'm going to explain at the beginning of this talk, kind of quickly, why neither of those things is actually true. It is not true that causal decision theory uniquely recommends that recommends the shooting, and it's also very dicey, in the sense of being wrong, to say that the only rational action is to not shoot. Okay, so why is this? Well, there's a kind of assumption that Egan makes, and he makes it for sort of a good reason. He says, look, what does causal decision theory tell you to do? This is Egan. He says, well, look, what causal decision tells you to do is to do whatever has the best expected outcome, holding fixed your initial views about the likely causal structure of the world. Now, the reason he says this is because there's a line in this paper of David Lewis's called causal decision theory, where Lewis more or less says exactly that. Right? However, it turns out that's not right. I'll explain to you why Lewis would say such a thing. I mean, because there's sort of in the context in which he was speaking, you could kind of say that. But Egan's idea is, look, you want to know what causal decision theory tells you to do. In this case that I've described, the answer is really simple. Take your probabilities as they are right now. Calculate causal expected utilities. The act that has the highest outcome, that's the one you ought to do. And if you do that, it's true that well, shooting comes out on top. There's a kind of a commitment here, I think, that Egan makes, which I have described like this, that if your subjective probabilities at a certain time, so I'm in this framework where I'm thinking of your beliefs as described by a probability function. So if at a certain time your beliefs are characterized by that probability function there. And if when you use that, you calculate the causal expected utility of an act like this, as you should, then Egan says, then you should perform the act that has the highest causal expected utility on the basis of your time t probability. So at any time t, you want to know sort of the thing to do. Well, consult your degrees of belief right now, your credences right now. Use those to calculate causal expected utilities and do the thing that maximizes. Right? And as I say down here, if Egan were right about this, he'd be right about what causal decision theory tells you to do. It would tell you to shoot categorically. That's the unique best thing to do. But so the first thing I'm going to argue, I'm going to make like 2 points today. The first one is this, right? The reason why this principle I have, current opinion, it fixes action, is actually wrong, and wrong in this particular case, is because what causal and decision theorists really tell you to do, and I think sort of always have said this, is they say, look, what you want to do is you want to be sure to, A, take all the information at your disposal about what your acts are likely to cause into account, and B, once you've done that, maximize expected utility. And the thing that the error that Egan makes is he thinks that you should maximize causal expected utility with your initial probabilities in inverted lesions, but as I'm going to argue right now, those probabilities turn out to leave out a bunch of causally relevant information. So that's going to be the first. Oops, sorry, going too fast. So really, what the theory is committed to, causal decision theory is committed to, is something more like this, right? At any given time, you can take your opinions and at that time evaluate causal expected utilities, right? So if I ask you, gee, from your current perspective, what seems best? You can say, oh, well, you know, maybe S. I should shoot. That might seem best, right? But it's a further thing to say something about what you should do. Right? So I'm telling you, so the causal decision theory says, I'm going to give you a sort of, you know, a recipe for assessing utilities of actions in light of opinions, right? And then you say, okay, so once I've done that, should I act? And the answer the causal decision theory ought to give is, well, you should act if the opinions you're using in these assessments actually have taken into account all the information that's easily available to you. All right. So it might be the case, and I think it is the case, that in a case like murder lesion or something, if you give me your degrees of belief at time t for having the lesion or not, and you ask me, okay, so given my current degrees of belief, it looks like so shooting is the act that maximizes causal expected utility. Should I do it? The causal and decision theorists should say, well, have you satisfied certain other conditions? Right? What conditions? Well, here's one. So this is just what I said, I think. So here's a condition, right? That says, look, you should act on the basis of your expected utility evaluations at a time, just in case the beliefs on which these assessments are based, these expected utility assessments are based, turn out to incorporate all the evidence that's both available to you at the time and relevant to questions about what your acts are likely to cause. Now, the point to be emphasized, I think, which is important here, the kind of information that you might need to take into account can include information about how likely you are to perform various actions, or how good these various actions might look to you now, right? That information can turn out to be relevant information that you're obliged to take into account, provided that it's information that concerns the question about what your acts are likely to cause. Now, in passing, these 2 points. In passing, I should say, so I'm making a distinction between choosing to maximize causal expected utility given your beliefs at a time, and choosing to do so given your sort of fully informed beliefs, right? The beliefs that sort of take into account all the evidence that you have at your disposal, right? Now, I think this is a crucial distinction for Egan's example, but there was kind of an unfortunate. It's a fact about the history of the way causal and decision theory got developed is that it got developed in connection with sort of like these Newcomb problems, right? And the thing about Newcomb problems, so these Newcomb problems are cases. How many people know the Newcomb problem? Some will go. Oh, okay. So I won't go too much, but the Newcomb problem cases are like the murder lesion case, except they have another feature that one act is sort of the dominant act. You do better by choosing that act, right? Whatever happens. And if you're faced with a problem like that, this distinction between choosing on the basis of your initial probabilities and choosing on the basis of the probabilities that incorporate all the relevant information about what your acts will cause turns out not to matter. So that's actually why Lewis in his article says, oh, we can just use our initial expected utilities to make this choice, because in the Newcomb problem you can. But in problems like this murder lesion problem, it turns out to be crucial to make this distinction. All right. Let's skip on to because I want to get here. Okay. The other thing, which I think is really crucial to sort of understanding these problems, is that if you've got a real decision problem here, right? And people oftentimes sort of they look at these problems and they say, "Gee, that doesn't seem like a real decision problem to me." If you've got a real decision problem, I think that there's this further a condition that sort of has to be met, right? Which is you have to regard yourself as having freedom of action about whether or not you're going to shoot, right? And what does that take? Well, according to me, that takes at least the following. Well, I'll start here, right? To the extent that you take yourself to be free to do what you want in these kinds of cases, it ought to be the case that your probability for performing a particular act that you're not already sure you're going to perform, given that the expected utility of that act is higher than the alternative, I'm imagining in case we're going out, you can only choose A or its negation, right? Then what ought to happen is that the information that A, given your current assessments, that A has a higher expected utility than its negation, should cause you to increase your confidence that you're going to do it. Right? So just intuitively what the idea is, so if it's true that I, at the moment, evaluate A as the better act, then it would be very odd for me to think, gee, the probability of A is, say, lower than the probability of not A or something like that, right? So I impose this kind of a condition here. I'm going to skip over this a little bit fast. So when you impose this condition, you're kind of forced into a dynamical perspective here, right? You're in this spot where in the initial case, you've got these beliefs. And part of these beliefs is that, well, I'll go back here. When you take a look at this case, there's the area where when you shoot, right? And it turns out that your probability for shooting is actually pretty low, given these initial conditions, right? And it turns out that it's crucial that it be low, right? Because the more confident you get that you're going to shoot, it turns out the more confident you are that you have the lesion, which makes shooting look less bad, right? So you're beginning from a point here, and you know this, right? You think, gee, I'm awfully unlikely to shoot, but boy, that looks like the best action, right? Well, according to this principle, like the freedom principle, as I'm calling it here, right? That's a case where the information that shooting looks better than not shooting is information that's relevant to what your acts are likely to cause, right? And it's information which, if you incorporate it in, should make you increase your degree of belief. All right, so I'm going to sort of skip over the next slide, but I put it there so that you understand that this all can be worked out properly. So, in just blank on the name of the 1990 book, Dynamics of Rational Deliberation. You just need the first word. In his 1990 book, Brian sort of kind of describes this picture of a deliberation, rational deliberation, which actually, it turns out, agrees entirely with the things that I've just said, right? You know, it turns out that what happens in this process is, you know, you begin from some initial state, like the murder lesion state. What happens in that state is you take a look at what acts you value higher than others. It turns out that acts that sort of look sort of better than average have their probabilities increased. Once you do that, though, that increase in the probability sort of it's used to sort of update your views about the state of the world. So in the murder lesion case, you say, okay, I prefer to shoot. Let me take that information into account. I take it into account by updating. Then I ask myself on that basis, okay, so how probable is it now that I have the lesion? It turns out that the probability then goes up, right? And this process iterates itself until you come to some equilibrium state. Now, I won't actually argue for this, but in a paper that I'll refer to you to at the end, you know, it turns out that this equilibrium state is exactly the one, I argue, in which you've taken all your causally relevant information into account, right? And thus, it's the one that the causal decision theory says it's okay to act on, right? You're not supposed to act until you sort of attain this state, because if you sort of haven't yet attained this state, there's information out there which you have at your disposal, which, if you take it into account, will change your views about what is or is not a good thing to do. All right, so let's go back to murder lesion. I'm going to just sum all this up here in the slide, because this is going to be what brings me to the next point. So, okay, so what's the answer to the murder lesion case? Here's what I say. I say that this is the answer. Look, if you understand that what you ought to be doing is you ought to be acting only after you've taken all the causally relevant information about what you have to disposal into account. And if you understand that that's its equilibrium state, then what turns out to happen in this case is you end up in an equilibrium that I've described here at the bottom, right? Which has the following property. So, and you have sort of like this full information condition, you take yourself to be free, right? Then the only state condition, the only state consistent with all that is a state where you assign the same expected utility to shooting and to not shooting. You think that you've got a 1/3 chance of having the lesion, and that's your probability for shooting. I did these numbers. I couldn't come up with a case where the numbers worked out nicely, and it always ended up with things like 33 over 85 or something. But anyway, causal decision theory says that's the state in which you act. Now notice, causal decision theory says in that state, shooting and not shooting have the same causal expected utility. So, according to me, what causal decision theory says is you can't go wrong. Right? Once you've reasoned yourself into the right kind of a spot to make a choice, you can shoot, you can not shoot. It should be a matter of indifference for you. Or you could have a coin and you can toss it and shoot if and only if it comes up heads. The bias of the coin doesn't matter. Those are all, according to me, the same. equally good. Okay, now what's kind of weird about that? Well, yeah, this is just a way of saying the same thing I just said, but I'll skip over it. So what's a little bit weird about this, of course, is that it's still true that if I irrevocably choose to shoot, let's say it's a kind of an odd gun where instead of pulling the trigger, you press a button and then it takes about like 10 seconds to shoot, or something like that, right? Well, in that little 10-second period, I decide to shoot, I'm going to say, oh, how stupid was that? I'm a shooter type, right? I probably have the lesion, right? That was a horrible idea. In the same way, if I decided not to shoot, right? And I get up, I put the gun down, and I walk away, and I'll be thinking, and I can't go back to the irrevocable. I'll be thinking to myself, oh, jeez, I'm a non-shooting type. I almost certainly haven't got the lesion. I could have killed him, right? So it does seem like there's something odd about this answer that I've just recommended, right? I've just said, and I'm going to say at the end, right? You can't go wrong. There's no wrong decision. Anything you do is right. All right, so, but you might be worried for the reasons that I just said, and to put this more sort of formally, the problem with death in Damascus and this murder lesion case and sort of other cases is that they lack ratifiable pure actions, right? An act is a ratifiable act just in case it has the following property. If this is I decide irrevocably on A, and this is I decide irrevocably on A here as well, an act is a ratifiable act just in case on the assumption that I decide to do it, it still looks best. Right? And of course, in the murder lesion case, neither act has this property, because if I decide to shoot, right, not shooting looks better. If I decide not to shoot, then shooting looks better. Okay, so there's a bunch of explanation there of why that's true, but let's skip on to the next slide. So you might, and people have, say, well, look, actions that have this kind of feature of being unratifiable are very strange as choices, right? You know you're in a spot that if you choose them, it's going to look bad. Moreover, and I want to emphasize this point, right? In this kind of a picture, I am imagining that once I've made a choice, right, I have information at that point that I don't now have. And that information also, I want to emphasize, is clearly relevant to what the consequences of my act will be. And so, you might say, well, gee, so that makes unratifiable acts pretty weird. Because they're acts which you have, if you're going to choose them, you have to be happy with the consequence that upon choosing them, you're going to have more relevant information about what your acts are going to cause, and you're going to think it was a lousy choice. Right? So here's the man himself. This is Bill, right? So in the talk that I heard, the talk I heard became a paper, the 1986 paper that I have listed, and he puts the point, you know, as clearly as it can be put. He said, look, here's the rule: choose from among your ratifiable options, if there are any, one which maximizes unconditional causal expected utility. Right? So I just want to emphasize the first part, right? He doesn't say choose from all your options. It's choose from the ratifiable one. So the picture is, look, if an action is unratifiable, cross it out. And make your choice on the basis of the actions which are left. He goes on to say, I regard cases where no act is ratifiable as genuinely pathological and have no qualms about allowing causal expected utility theory to make no real recommendations about them. So this is like the murder lesion case, right? And a part of what I'm saying is, you know, I guess I have no qualms about certain decision problems that the theory doesn't make any real sort of recommendations about, but I think the theory does make a recommendation about murder lesion. And the recommendation is either act is equally good, right? Okay. He goes on to say, I'll read just a little more of this. The radical element in this proposal is in its restriction to ratifiable alternatives when you maximize causal expected utility. This is radical because it can clash with the recommendation to, in fact, maximize causal expected utility over all options. Right? And as I say, this line of reasoning from this source actually had me quite convinced for a long time, right? But I've come as a result of thinking about the Egan case to think that it isn't the way to go. Now why? Sorry. Well, okay. So I say I disagree. So this is just an assertion without an argument. I say so. The mere fact that an act is unratifiable, the mere fact that an act is unratifiable does not make it impermissible for choice. And I claim this even when there are ratifiable alternatives available. So I'm making the most extreme case I can here. So as I said, in murder lesion, I think this is just such a case, right? Where it's perfectly permissible to perform unratifiable acts. Okay, now you might say, I expect people are going to say, look, that can't be right because after all, there is this fact that I was explaining that the thing about unratifiable acts is they have this strange feature. You know you're going to regret them. Moreover, you know you're going to regret them in a position when you know more than you know now about what your acts are likely to cause. So does this matter? I shouldn't say no. I should say that it does matter, but it matters in a way that unconditional causal expected utility actually is able to take into account. So I'll explain that in a minute. But so there is this recent paper by Frank Arzenius where he wants to kind of defend a ratifiability principle, and he wants to defend it on the basis of a principle which is called weak desire irreflection, right? And the weak desire irreflection principle, which is quite plausible, I think, says, well, look, if your desires at some future time, t, arise solely as a result of conditioning on some new piece of evidence, right? So he's not concerned with any sort of special kind of fancy cases. He's just imagining the only thing that changes between time 1 and time 2 is you learn some new piece of evidence. Then the principle says your expected utility for an act now should be your expectation of your expected utility of that act in the future when you know more. Okay? Seems like a reasonable principle. And then what Arzenius says is he sort of glosses the principle by saying irrational persons should not be able to anticipate, foresee that she will regret her decisions, right? So he's interpreting this as a kind of a no regret principle, and the idea is, look, once you sort of choose something, you should be in a spot where, you should never be in a spot where you know you're going to regret your actions, right? And so one way to gloss this, which would lead you to the ratifiability principle, is to say something like this. Well, look, it's impermissible to choose an act at this time 1 if you know that at time 2 you'll both have more evidence about A's causal consequence and will regard it as less than optimal. Right? So what this says is, it says, look, if I know I'm going to regret A at time 2, there'll be some other option that I want, then I shouldn't be performing it now. And if this is true, then it is correct to have ratifiability considerations override unconditional expected utility considerations. Right? Now, I want to say, however, it's not the case that that's true. Okay, so the key thing in this slide, I'll just illustrate with an example. It's clearly the case, I think, that the fact that you will regret some action ought to be relevant, or sort of can be relevant anyway, to how you assess actions right now. So if you take an example, let's say you've got a ghost pepper. Anybody sort of had one of these things, these ghost peppers? Right? They're used to keep away like elephants in India to farm things. They weaponize them. Right. So you might have a ghost pepper, and say, "Yeah, I'm thinking of eating this," and I might say, "Look, trust me, you will definitely regret it." Right? Well, that's clearly a case where I've given you information that really should make you rethink. Right? But what's important about that case is that the way that information changes your views about things is it changes your assessments of the consequences of action, so that, after I've told you that, your unconditional causal expected utility for eating the pepper ought to be really low, if you believe me. And please believe me. All right, so there's a kind of a weaker principle. No regrets 2, I call it, what says, look, it's impermissible to choose an act at a time when one knows one will have more evidence of some future time. And this evidence, it requires that your current expected utilities have a certain property, right? That the act A is less than some act B. Now, this is a principle that causal decision theorists ought to accept. It's a principle that is actually a consequence of weak desire reflection principle. This no regrets 1 principle actually is not a consequence of that principle. It's something even stronger, right? So I say, well, look, if you want to know how regret gets factored into decision making, here's your principle. Right? What does that mean? Well, I'm arguing here that the mere fact that an act is unratifiable, taken by itself, isn't a sufficient reason not to do it, right? That said, what I want to make clear here in this case, like the simple case, but the idea is completely sort of general, is that there's a certain sense in which the relevant ratifiability considerations are already taken into account in unconditional expected utility. So, what I've done here is I've just rewritten. How much time do I have?
0.
0. Okay. So it's. Okay, I need a question. Okay, give me maybe 4 minutes, and then I'll. So if you just take a look at this. I have expressed the expected utility of S and not S, shooting, not shooting, in the following way. I have looked at the utility of S, given that I decide on S, and weighted that by the probability of me coming to that decision, right? And the utility of S deciding on not S, and the probability of coming to that decision, right? And the thing that I want to call your attention to here is that when I compare the utility of S, utility of not S, a part of what I'm doing is I am comparing this term to that term, and I'm comparing this term to that term. Now, if you think about those comparisons the way that I've done it down here, you can kind of think of what's going on in those comparisons as kind of a regret profile, I'm calling it, right? The information about how much you will regret, for example, here, a decision to do S, right? How much you will regret a decision to do S is, I'm sorry, the M thing there from an earlier version of the slides where I had like a mixed act included, but I took it out. But But here you'll notice that, well, okay, so I've got this difference here, which is the difference between those two terms, and that kind of is a measure, given the utilities I have here, of how much I would regret S upon choosing it. And here is a measure of how much I would regret its negation, not S, upon choosing it, right? And the point that I want to make here is that, well, when I compare these two actions, a part of what I'm implicitly doing is I'm comparing their regret profile, right? And what happens, I won't do the calculations here, I just put it down, but it's obvious, is that, you know, it turns out that in this kind of equilibrium that I'm talking about, what's happening is that you have that identity. And what is that identity? Well, it says, well, look, you've got more, you're going to, this term here is bigger. So you're going to regret shooting more, you're going to regret shooting if you choose it more than you're going to regret not shooting if you choose it, right? But that information about these regrets, right, turns out to be sort of offset by the improbability of making those decisions. And when things are just like this, you're in this equilibrium I talked about, where sort of your regrets kind of completely balance out given the probabilities. Okay, so I claim comparisons of unconditional expected utilities implicitly incorporate the magnitude of your regrets upon making various decisions, and then they discount these regrets by the improbability. The rest of it is important. I'll close with this slide, but it's important for me to mention this. Now, the thing that you might still be worried about here is it's still true, right, that you know you're going to regret whatever you do. Okay, but the point I want to make is having a poor regret profile, having that be unratifiable, for example, is not enough to remove it from consideration. Why? Because when you're in this equilibrium, and I'm going to just explain what's on this slide really quickly. When you're in this equilibrium, right, you're in this spot where you think, gee, I'm a third likely to have a lesion and I'm 2/3 likely not to have a lesion. That's what you believe, right? And under those conditions, you have to ask yourself, gee, I know that I'm going to regret shooting if I choose it, right? But of course, those regrets might be warranted or not. What do I mean by warranted? I mean, they might be the kind of regrets that would make sense if I knew if I had the lesion or not, right? So I'm in this position where I know I'm going to have the regrets, but I'm actually not sure they're going to be warranted regrets, right? I might be in a spot where I regret shooting, but I don't have the lesion, right? Those regrets shouldn't make any difference to me, right? The ones that should are the ones where I have the regret, I regret shooting and I have the lesion. That's like a warranted one for me, a regret. And so the position I'm in is one where I say, gee, I've got to kind of discount the fact that I'm going to have these regrets and their magnitude by my sort of my best assessment of the degree to which these regrets are in fact warranted, right? And so this is the conclusion down here. You need to temper the negative implication of an act's unratifiability in light of your beliefs about the potentially unwarranted nature of those regrets. And as soon as you do that, I think you end up getting sort of the right story, which I'll just go through real quick, or maybe I'll just leave up there because I think that I've said everything I have to say. Well, I'll go through quickly. You know you will regret each act you choose after you choose it. You'll then think that's a warranted regret. But now, when you don't know whether or not you have the lesion and all you can do is go on the basis of the evidence you have at your disposal, right? You can't regard the fact that you will regret either choice as a decisive reason against choosing it because you don't know the regret's going to be warranted. So, question: what should you do? Well, you should do the best you can. You should take the information about what you're going to regret. You should try to discount it by the question whether these regrets in fact are warranted or not. And as soon as you do that, I argued before, you've actually just computed an unconditional causal expected utility. So what do you do? What do you do in murder legion? You can do anything you want. Death in Damascus, what do you do? Go to Aleppo, you can go to Damascus. It's not that there's no sort of right choice, which is the unratifiability view I take it. It's that there's no wrong choice. So I'll stop right there.
We have time for questions.
I think one thing that's you're pointing out that what I was doing with the ratifiability is already coming in automatically if they do dynamic deliberation, essentially, and that might be right. I want to. I mean, one of the things that I think is really important in what we've done is that when we were starting the causal decision tree, we had these examples where a certain way of where the main, I mean, how to put it? You have Savage's basic decision theory, where you have presumed causal independence of the states of the outcomes,
right.
And the acts can't influence those. And none of these problems come up. You just can't formulate these things. And we had Jeffrey coming along with examples which supported wanting to have some way of considering conditional and proposing an alternative theory that would be using the conditional probabilities of the states on the acts.
Right.
Now, I think that the Newcomb problem and a bunch of these problems that we've all had in the literature are fairly decisive against the appropriateness of evidential decision.
Yes, right. I agree with that entirely, yes.
Though some of evidential decision theories came up with a way of using ratifiability that get the same answers that we
right.
would give in those cases. And now nothing in this Egan case threatens any of that.
Right, yeah,
okay,
agreed,
so,
right.
But now what you've done is to give, I mean, we have two parts of the part that I'm just right on board with you directly right now is the part that you've shown that the Egan case, that the causal decision theory doesn't give the answer that he thinks it gives
right.
in the case. The case has all these features that. Now and by the way, okay, so that's, I want to get that. Now the thing about having that the dynamic deliberation actually recovers the stuff I was trying to do directly with this version of ratifiability. I have to think more about that. The kind of cases that I want to use it for is applications in game theory situations,
right.
where, for example, in all kinds of games where you're guessing where it hit the bottom, where you have no, I mean, recovering the argument, von Neumann and Morgenstern's argument to get a solution for these zero-sum games, where there aren't any, where none of the pure acts would be ratifiable on best reply, but you're going to get where you have a mixed strategy equilibrium that is arguably the right solution. And the ratifiability gave you a way to directly get that. Now, can that still come out in the way you're doing this thing?
Yeah. So I mean, I too had like the game theory case in mind.
Okay.
So in something like the same way that the focus on the Newcomb problem sort of obscured an important distinction, I think. I think that just looking at games when you have enough common knowledge, the players end up in an equilibrium kind of obscure something too. In those cases, it's going to be true, right, that the ratifiability view is not going to actually lead you wrong, right? But there are sort of other kinds of cases which some decision theorists, some game theorists look at, right? The kind of a case where you have an equilibrium in a belief that's not like a Nash equilibrium, right? So we have these two players. We've each got our beliefs. On the basis of our beliefs about about ourselves and the other players, we've each got sort of a profile of acts, sort of rational acts. But because we don't have enough common knowledge about the case, these acts aren't in equilibrium, so they're not sort of a best response to the other one, right? And in those kinds of cases, which bear analogies to this Egan type case. So I had it in like longer version of this paper discussing the game theory, but I have to yank that out, put some other thing because it's too long, right? But in those kinds of cases, right, I'm going to want to say the same thing. I'm going to want to say, well, look, unratifiability is not the right guide in that case. I mean, it is in all these ordinary cases. It works just perfectly, right? But if you go out into these odd cases where you have agents who don't have enough common knowledge, who sort of think the kind of case that's the problem is, we're involved in a game. We each think that our acts are correlated, but we think they're correlated in a different way, so that we end up making sure, right? In that kind of case, I want to say, look, ratifiability leads you wrong, and you should just maximize.
I know. I just want to. Now, there's a case. I mean, that Binmore's centipede game finally convinced me that we don't always want to have equilibrium as the rational acts. I mean, because this was a big change for me. But would this happen when you're doing your thing? I mean, one of the things that happens is you remove some of the common knowledge stuff.
Yes.
And then you can go as the centipede game is one where okay, two players are playing. If they both cooperate on the first move, they each get $1. If if player 2 defects, it goes over and they do it again. And if they both cooperate, say player 1 will get, player 2 will get $2, player 1 will still get 1, and you get it going up to 100 or so, where they're into hundreds of dollars, and we could do it. Of course, the versions that economists have, it's thousands, but you know. Okay, and now the question, it turns out the only equilibrium is they're going to defect on the first move. And there seems to be something quite irrational, something not quite good about it. We don't like that, but that's the only equilibrium.
Well,
and
well, that's the case where backwards induction actually seems
yeah,
to
backward
be correct.
induction seems to go wrong.
No, correct.
No, you're wrong. And now, but it turns out there's a folk theorem in the game theory literature. It's called a folk theorem, but if there's any failure of common knowledge at any level, then that can get you out quite far. It won't get you right to the end, but it'll get you very far out. And it's taken me a long time to start to think that there's something in the idealizations in game theory of the common knowledge stuff that is quite right to give up. And I think Binmore is quite right about that part of it. It's the common knowledge that's giving you the... Okay, now, what I want to... So that, it should turn out that your kind of considerations here might also be allowing this moving out. And I can't resist, I mean, in the evolutionary dynamical interpretation, you can get out pretty far in these things by looking at the... Okay, so that's a... I know.
Well,
okay.
I mean, on the set of cases, so the upshot of this, right? The upshot of this is, and I mean, I think this is just universal across the board, right? How you should make decisions is this: you should take all the available information about what your acts are likely to cause into account, and then maximize unconditional causal expected utility. Period. Right? I mean, that's what this says. That's the whole story. Now, in something like the centipede game, for example, right? So I'll just involve myself in this, right? I mean, it's always to me seemed like a part of what the centipede shows is that that the common knowledge assumptions are really strong.
Yes.
And I think that if you, I think myself, and I'm sure it's a consequence of the way that I am approaching things, that if you make those very strong assumptions right at the start, the only way to go is to defect on the first one, because that's what maximizes causal expected utility. Now,
but I agree with you on that,
Yeah.
but I think of it as challenging the appropriateness of those common knowledge assumptions for looking at this.
well, I mean, so then there's the question of, okay, so what the centipede shows is that these common knowledge assumptions are sort of really strong,
Yeah.
right? And it might well be the case that if we want to sort of model any kind of real, and this is true, any kind of a marginally realistic kind of situation, we have to like relax them. And what's interesting about the centipede game is, it seems like relaxing them any way, even a little bit, makes some big changes.
differences, yeah.
It's sort of one of the interesting things about that game,
Yeah.
right? But I mean, I would say there and every place else. Tell me what the knowledge is that the players have a maximized unconditional causal expected utility without any ratifiability conditions, and that's what they should do, right? And as I say, it doesn't really quite show up until you get to some games where you've got the players with having a sufficient amount of sort of uncertainty about the others, and that you don't have an equilibrium.
What about the case where you have lots of ratifiable elements? I imagine you'd say exactly the same thing.
Yes.
But I like that.
Yeah. No. So if you so on an earlier version of this slide, which I didn't include because I realized I was going to run over time, and I didn't have enough room. I packed my slides too much anyway. I didn't have enough room in that slide. I had included another act here, a mixed act where you play, where you toss a coin with the equilibrium probabilities, and you shoot just in case heads, right? Now, what's going to happen there? I think this is where I left in that. I was calling this act M. So the whole regret profile turns out to be a little bit more complicated when you add more acts, right? And this act M turns out to be the uniquely ratifiable act in this case, right? But I mean, I say, look, so all the information in these regret profiles is always going to appear in appear in these comparisons between acts. So the story is going to be sort of computationally more complicated, but the idea is all of the relevant information's in there. And if you have a lot of ratifiable acts, what this is going to say is, well, that all by itself doesn't mean anything. What can mean something is if you have an act and conditional on deciding upon that act, it's say a lot better than something else. But yeah, I mean, I'm going to say the same thing.
Same thing.
Yeah.
So if you have like you're meeting your fairy godmother in Damascus or Aleppo,
Yeah.
so on, so both are terrific, right, in terms of ratifiability. And if you're sitting at the unstable mixed equilibrium,
Yeah.
then every choice is fine.
Every choice is fine, right?
Okay.
Yeah, every choice is fine. I mean, and which means that in order to get yourself unstuck, you might need some rule to pick an act, right? Where that's but the rule like to pick an act is just a rule like to get you off the dime. It doesn't really say anything about the value of the act itself. But yeah, I'm going to say it there too.
Right.
So, to what extent do you think could we cheat on this? I mean, I like the story about the consistency of the theory with the deliberation dynamics. But what I mean cheat by recognize at an early stage that following the dynamics, if I can, will lead to this equilibrium, which makes every act correct. Can I cut short the dynamics with this early recognition and just do whatever I want?
Yeah. Well, okay. So this is good because this when I explained this to Egan, this was his response. It was sort of gee, wait a second, that makes that makes the theory, you know, completely redundant. And in fact, it's even worse than that, because really in this kind of case, to find the equilibrium, if you go back to my very early on, right? To find the equilibrium, right? It turns out that the only information that you actually need in this sort of broad kind of cases where you get conditional probabilities that have the kind of ordering among them that I have up there, it turns out that the only thing that matters is the utility, right? Because the equilibrium turns out to be the point where, you know, that act and that have the same causal expected utility. So I don't even have. So I can just. I can get rid of that number and get rid of that number and get rid of that number and just say, oh, that's, you know, sort of. It's just a number, and that's a big number, and that's a small number, and then you know that the 2x is the same unconditional causal expected utility. And so it does look like, oh, well, so there's this easy way, right? You just get to choose. Now, I'm committed to that, but let me temper, right? There's sort of two questions here. Can you just, without thinking very hard about the problem or the information that you have, choose an action that you might say, let me use the word rationalizable for this, an action for which you have a coherent rationale? And the answer to that is yes. Right? Now, of course, we might be a little bit concerned about a person, for other reasons, who sort of made that choice without being able to see, right, what the, you know, without having sort of incorporated all of the causally relevant information at their disposal in the compile. But I'm still going to say that as far as the question of, given your beliefs and desires, and given the information you have on hand, can you make a mistake? In the sense of, can you choose an act that's actually going to be one for which you don't have to have a rationale? The answer is no. Let me say one more thing about it.
And now that we've all heard you talk, we all have a rationale.
Yeah, right. But interestingly enough, right, it's the same with something like the Newton problem, right? I mean, what's interesting about the Newton problem is you don't have to do all this business about thinking it through. You can just look at the dominant structure and say, I know what act is right, which is sort of another way of saying, look, I could think this through, and I could come to an equilibrium, but I know how I choose. And it turns out that this kind of example has that character as well. Now, there are going to be all kinds of examples which don't. You know, more sort of ordinary examples, they don't have that character. You actually have to process the information. But yeah, you know, I'm stuck with that. I agree.
Now, we can have, I mean, versions of Alan's David and Bathsheba type examples where you can cook versions where you don't get the dominance, but you're still getting a different answer. You can make up versions that will do that. It should still turn out to be that. I mean, you're still going to get the more causal decision. Of course, yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
You can do it. And if you.
I'm not offhand. Not offhand, like remembering the structure of that one exactly.
Two kinds of kings, the charismatic ones and uncharismatic ones. And you have. We'll get.
Yeah. Okay. Let me. I'm trying to. I did like put another example in the board, which I think helps to make sense.
Okay.
And I'm trying to remember if that example has the same kind of structure as this. So I drew this up. Okay, so this is an example due to Anil Gupta, and Egan reports this example in his paper, and I sort of like it because I think it's an example that the theory that I've just described gets completely right.
Okay.
Right? So you can be one of the three types. You can be like the smoker type, you can be the drinker type, you can be the abstainer type. So you're going to go to a party and you're going to be offered a smoke and you're going to be offered a drink, and it turns out that at this party you can't have both. And it turns out that these things have various effects on you. Let's say with effects for how good a time you have this evening, right? And here's the picture that it turns out that people who are sort of smokers would do a little bit better drinking. Sort of a little bit better drinking than smoking. But the worst thing for them would be to abstain. Right? That would be a terrible outcome. And the same way with a drinker, right? They do a little bit better smoking than drinking, but much better than abstaining, right? But it turns out that the abstainers actually do best if they abstain, but not by much. Okay, so so here in this case, I'm sort of imagining this is a person who will decide on smoking, person who will decide on drinking, person who will decide on abstaining, and so this act is not a ratifiable act because if you decide to smoke, you think, I should have drank. If you decide to drink, you say, I should have smoked, right? But the ratifiable act is this one down here, where the right thing to do is abstain. You abstain, you say, well, I'm a little bit better off than I would be if I did any of those other things. Now, what Egan reports Gupta as arguing, which seems to me to be sort of pretty compelling, right? Suppose that you're pretty sure you're not going to abstain, right? I mean, you're just, you're that kind. And so you assign a very high probability to this disjunction of this or this, right? And on that basis, it looks like abstaining is a terrible idea, because you're probably a drinker type or a smoker type, and for either of those types, it's a bad idea to abstain. But if you just accepted a straight ratifiability view, it would say, oh, ignore that fact, right? Ignore the fact that given your current views, abstaining would be a terrible idea, and choose the ratifiable act, right? And so in a case like this, I want to say, okay, so what do you want in a decision theory? Well, you want it in a decision theory, you want to be able to take all this information into account, right? And very importantly, in a quantitative way, right? The thing about ratifiability, a part of it is that it's just this qualitative, unratifiable or not. You want to be able to take all this information into account, right? You want to be able to take into account that, gee, if you smoke, abstaining would be really bad. And you want to do it in a way that sort of makes sense of the idea that it seems pretty clear that you ought not be abstaining here, right? And it turns out that if you do it this way, it works out exactly right, right? And so, I think sort of examples of this kind put pressure on the idea that you've got ratifiability considerations.
This is very compelling. The direct ratifiability, this is going to be absolutely, I'm convinced on this.
Thanks.
Thank you.